Hey there, everyone. Lee Stranahan. Nice to see you. Hope you're having a good weekend. It's a 3-day weekend. Martin Luther King Day, of course, tomorrow. And I want to talk to you about some stuff. I've been researching all weekend. I've been researching 19th century stuff for reasons that are too obscure to explain. But as any of you know, if you've been following my work for a while, I've talked a lot about how understanding some of the stuff that's gone on in the 19th century, such as the rise of Cecil Rhodes, and that led to Milner's Kindergarten, the stuff Carol Quigley's reported about for decades. Carol Quigley, of course, a teacher of Bill Clinton's. Bill Clinton actually thanked him when he first got the nomination for president. And Carol Quigley exposed the roundtable groups, these secret groups, largely, some of them operating right out in plain sight, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, for instance, that came out of this group in England in the 19th century. And I've been researching more of that, and I want to explain how it relates to today, because some people think that this 19th century stuff, well, whatever, it's interesting history, but who cares? You know, you probably didn't like history in school. Maybe you did. Maybe you like the History Channel, but they won't show you this stuff. And the stuff I'm going to show you, do me a favor. I don't want you to take my word for any of it. So I'm going to be here. I'll be able to bring up the... let me just get this set up. I'll be able to bring up on the screen. Word for any of this. This is all stuff that you can look up and find yourself and confirm it. And do me a favor. We're going to talk about some of this stuff on my show I do with Jason Goodman on Patreon, High Dive. We'll talk about that Wednesday. We'll talk about that a little bit on my radio show, the backstory, in the coming weeks. We'll have some guests on about it. But you can look it up now, so I'm giving you a little bit of a preview. So one of the things I've talked about in the past is the centrality to the Russiagate narrative, to understand it, and I'm the only reporter who's covered this. Bill Browder, you have to understand that, because Bill Browder, who put forth a fraudulent bill that was passed by a bipartisan huge majority in the U.S. Congress, the Magnitsky Act in 2012. John McCain was a big sponsor of that. And, by the way, some of these people, Joe Biden's connected to Khodorkovsky, I've talked about a lot. Khodorkovsky, well, here's the way to find that. Let me switch over to that. because HSBC was actually founded to fund, you'll see HSBC in a second, to help fund the Opium War. What was the Opium War? So let me talk about this for a second and give you some history you may not know. And it's actually pretty shocking. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier. She was shocked. So the Opium Wars, what happened was, in the early 18th century, China was the biggest economy in the world. China was self-sufficient, and they controlled about 65% of the world's gross domestic product. And they were self-sufficient. They didn't need to trade with other countries because they didn't want the cultural influence and they didn't want to be beholden. Pretty smart. Now, the British had started to develop a middle class and a middle class, not royalty, not that upper middle class, but upper middle class enough where they could get a little fancy. And a lot of these British people, and they're not the problem, they started to like goods that came from China, such as, for instance, porcelain, silk, and tea. Perhaps you've heard the British like their tea, right? So they wanted to get tea. The problem was China didn't want anything the Brits were selling. They weren't interested. They had their own economy. And the Emperor of China at that time wouldn't allow trade with China unless he approved it. They would take silver and gold, but the British didn't want to give up silver and gold. So a guy named David Sassoon, Sassoon, and let's look at him, shall we? Evil. Sassoon had connections. He was an Iraqi, and he was Jewish, and he traded with India. He had connections in India as well. And India was growing poppy that could be used to make opium. And opium was illegal, but it wasn't really followed in China at the time. But there was a demand for it. So this is Sassoon's idea that he pitched to the British, and they liked it. Since the Chinese don't want to trade goods with you, what if we sell opium on the black market, and then we use the money we make from selling opium to buy tea? So because the British people wanted tea, they sold opium, and they got millions of people addicted. And all of this, again, just look at David Sassoon, you'll find this. And his sons, they were known as the Rothschilds of the East. And in fact, one of them actually married into the Rothschild family in the mid to late 1800s. But what they did was they got millions of Chinese people addicted to opium by selling it. Now, as you may imagine, the Chinese did not like this very much, particularly the leaders who saw millions of, it was sort of like the 19th century version of the opioid crisis. You had people ODing and lives being destroyed, and they didn't like the fact that the British were doing this. And so they told the British, you need to stop doing this. And they started to do stuff like, for instance, the death penalty for drug dealers and stuff like that. And they started seizing the British opium. But Sassoon and his group, by this point, he controlled the opium trade in China. He and his sons controlled the opium trade. And they used the British military to fight back against the Chinese. And the Chinese had an advanced economy because they hadn't blown a lot of money on weapons, but the British had very powerful warships. And this started the Opium War. The Opium War was the British, to protect the opium trade, went to war with China. Think about how heinously evil that is. And think about whether there's modern parallels. And I mentioned earlier, the Sacklers could be sort of the modern American version of what the British were doing to the Chinese that started the Opium War. Now, all of this is stuff you can find. SBC's background at funding the West, the British in this case, addicting the Chinese, millions of Chinese people addicted to drugs due to the British, because the British didn't have anything they wanted to trade. That's not capitalism, by the way. This is criminality. That's what this is. And when the Chinese didn't like it, the British went to war with them and took their warships up and down the coast, destroying Chinese forts, until the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking and again, let's just look that up, shall we? The Treaty of Nanking in 1842, this ended the British aggression against China, because China was fighting back against them pushing opium on them. And this treaty, one of the things this established was Hong Kong as a protectorate. All the stuff that's going on with Hong Kong right now, this is not about, when you hear Hong Kong in the news, this is not about freedom and democracy. This is about protecting HSBC and the drug trade and the elites who profited from it over the past century or so, right? That's what's going on here. You're being lied to. And they don't want you to know this history because, as a normal person, you would object to this and you'd go, well, the British were the bad guys here. They weren't good guys at all. And if the only response you have to this is that somehow it's anti-Semitic because David Sassoon was Jewish and was a big Jewish philanthropist, let me point out that you're making the same argument people use to defend George Soros and stuff like that. That's where they call anything about someone who's Jewish anti-Semitic. It's not my fault that David Sassoon was Jewish or that he said that he only wanted Jews in the drug trade, which is what he said. He wanted the drug trade to be exclusively that realm, part of why he worked with his sons. Go look this up. I'm not making this up, and I kind of wish I were, because it would be less bothersome. But in my opinion, that's part of why we don't get the truth on this, is because of that trope argument. They play the race card, anti-Semitic version, which is any criticism of someone who's Jewish, no matter what they do, is anti-Semitic. And so they've buried this history. And let me point out something. I pointed this out to a friend, and I'll leave you. I've given you enough where you can start to look in some of this stuff. The other factor here is that we know, everyone knows that media is compromised. You know the newspapers and TV suck, right? You know that. I'm not telling you anything new there. And now social media sucks. But journalism controls present events. If you want to control history, One way to do it, and you'll see this with David Sassoon, he's a big philanthropist, as are the Sacklers today. They give a lot of money to universities, and they give a lot of money to museums. Think about it. If you want to control history, history is taught in the universities. The textbooks, even in your kids' school, come from the universities, right? Those historians, they don't ask high school history teachers, hey, do you want to write a textbook? It's the big fancy ones. So I'm saying philanthropy, one of the purposes or the effects that it has is by philanthropy, and the other place you learn history is in the museums. By funding the museums, by funding universities, and calling it philanthropy, it allows them to control the narrative for history the same exact way they control the narrative for current events by controlling the media, which is what the elite people want to do. And it was interesting that Scott Adams the other day called the global elite, he put it in quotes. Again, global elite are people around the globe with a lot of money and power. And and by the way, the British royalty, not Jewish. You may have noticed that. Queen Victoria, not Jewish. She profited off this quite a looker, on par with Nancy Pelosi. So it's a little chunkier. But I'm just saying, the British royalty profited from this as well. Clearly. Part of the way Sassoon was able to get away with what he got away with was he was paying off the royal family. And one of the younger Sassoons, I think it was Arthur, was good friends with Prince Charles, not the Lady Di one, the older one. But look up I think it was King Charles at that point. Look up this history and ask yourself why this history is being buried. And then you'll see this ties into Russiagate. You want to know why the narrative right now is that China is flooding the market with drugs? Funny, because that's exactly what the British did. But that's the history you're not told. Because if people knew that history, when they heard China being attacked now, I'm going to argue that the Cold War 2.0 stuff we're seeing is a way of misdirecting people. Accuse the accuser. Does that make sense? And we see that all throughout Russiagate, and we see it here. So don't take my word for it. Look up the history, learn it. And until next time, I'm Lee Stranahan. Bye-bye.